From the title of his book, Revolt of the Masses, it's not clear whether José Ortega y Gasset thinks this revolt is a good thing or not. He may be describing how such a revolt might happen, announcing that it has begun, or warning that it is coming. The timing of the publication of these essays in 1929, placing them between two world wars and amid the accelerating technological change of the early 20th century, does little to point to an answer to the question. Fortunately, his meaning does become clear in this short but dense book, and we will get into it. Before that, it's worth it to look briefly at his life, because these books and the ideas that are in them that we enjoy examining so much are, of course, written by people, and those people inevitably have lives that take place at certain times and in certain places that may inform their ideas in certain ways, and so that context, I think, is always useful. José Ortega y Gasset was born in Madrid in 1883. His father was the director of a newspaper that his mother's family owned. He studied philosophy in Spain and in Germany. He got married. He wrote for various newspapers and eventually wrote this essay, which made him internationally famous. Before that, in 1923, he founded a publication whose name translates to either Magazine of the West or Western Review, and he remained its director until 1936. That magazine promoted the translation and discussion of figures like Oswald Spengler, at whose writing we've looked in another episode of this podcast, and Bertrand Russell. Ortega y Gasset left Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and he lived in Buenos Aires for a while, and he eventually returned to Europe in 1942, and he made his way to Portugal and then to Spain in 1948 when he founded the Institute of Humanities, where he gave lectures, and then he died in Madrid, the city of his birth, in 1955. And when I first heard the title of this book, I wasn't sure what I was going to think of it, because I didn't know if it was going to be this patrician condescension toward the rising middle class. And while you might read between the lines and see a little bit of that, Ortega y Gasset gives clear definitions about what he means when he uses terms like mass man, and he's explicitly not talking about income level. He gives other definitions for the mass man and the select man that are pretty useful in articulating what we're talking about if we break with a particular dogma of democracy, which is that all people are exactly the same, or some version of that. He gives us a useful way of thinking about the essential difference that we're talking about. And it's not even something like intelligence or creativity, but we can let him say it when we get there. First, let's look at how he sets up the problem or the development that he's talking about. Ortega y Gasset writes, quote, "There is one fact which, whether for good or ill, is of utmost importance in the public life of Europe at the present moment. This fact is the accession of the masses to complete social power. As the masses, by definition, neither should nor can direct their own personal existence, and still less rule society in general, this fact means that actually Europe is suffering from the greatest crisis that can afflict peoples, nations, and civilization. Such a crisis has occurred more than once in history." End quote. So he says that the masses have taken complete social power, and this is the fact, whether for good or ill, that is of the utmost importance in the public life of Europe at the present moment, is how he says it. And he says this has occurred at other times in history. Now, this passage occurs very early in the book, and there's a clause in there that made me worried. He says, as the masses, by definition, neither should nor can direct their own personal existence, and still less rule society in general. I think there's an argument to be had over whether it's possible to have the masses rule society, to have actual democracy. That when you set up a system like that, what inevitably happens is that it becomes an oligarchy and you have elites running it, or whether, if it's possible, whether that's desirable. What tripped an alarm in my head when I read it was when he said, neither should nor can direct their own personal existence. And maybe that just triggered my 21st century American democratic priors. But this line does show something about where Ortega y Gasset is coming from. We might value a notion of subsidiarity, that the people who are the closest to the problem are the best equipped to deal with it, a kind of decentralization that would grant that a man who maybe is not educated in the formal sense is most suited to answer the questions and problems of his immediate environment because he has the most experience with them. And that if you take a doctrine like the masses neither can nor should direct their own personal existence out to its applications, what you end up with is a bureaucrat hundreds of miles away, either failing to answer the problems of this ordinary guy's life, or when they do so, doing it in an absurd way because they can't see the problem the way that he can. It's very easy to imagine this kind of situation, and so to react against a principle like that. Alternatively, there is a context in which I can see some wisdom in it, which is when I think of the life of my mother's mother. Her family was full-blooded Italian, though even she was, I think, third generation. Her grandmother had come from Italy when she was very little, and then her mother was born in America, and then she had also been born in America. But she had this very traditional Catholic Italian family life, because I never talked to her about this and she passed away some 15 years ago. I'm not sure exactly of how to characterize it, but it seems that she rejected a lot of that. And she was also a young person in the 60s when there was a lot of cultural vandalism going on generally. And I won't go into the details of it, but she got off track a little bit in the middle of her life. And then after maybe a decade or so, she went back to school and became a teacher and taught for several decades until her retirement. And I sometimes wonder if she would have been better off if she had lived a life more constrained by the traditional environment in which she grew up. And that's not a comment on her intelligence or her judgment. It's more about the difficulty of defining a life without borders. Most or all traditions and customs exist because they serve some practical purpose. The purpose may not be immediately obvious, and it may not be known at all to the people who are following the tradition or custom. But they're shaped the way that a coastline is shaped, in that they emerge gradually because of the circumstances that exist. And that, of course, doesn't mean that they're all inherently moral or they can't be questioned or replaced, but they are some set of guidelines that have historically been able to get people through life with some level of stability and sanity. And if you suddenly tear down all those guardrails, you might be able to live a better life in some way, but it may also be worse. And my grandmother's case is just one anecdote, and who knows, her life might have been worse if she had stayed in the environment that she grew up in. And also, there are other people whose lives are certainly harmed by the traditional environment that they're stuck in. But I wonder if Ortega y Gasset might have been thinking of examples like this, or observations that he had made that might have been along similar lines, when he says that the masses by definition neither should nor can direct their own personal existence. And again, later he gets a little bit more specific about what he means by the masses. Later he writes, quote, "The multitude has suddenly become visible, installing itself in the preferential positions in society. Before, if it existed, it passed unnoticed, occupying the background of the social stage. Now it has advanced to the footlights and is the principal character. There are no longer protagonists. There is only the chorus," end quote. And that image is interesting. He's talking, of course, about in especially ancient Greek theater, but in other theater as well, there was the chorus, which was a group of people on stage who would interact with the other characters. And they weren't usually the center of the drama. They were either commenting on it or asking the characters questions or describing what was going on. We got into that a little bit when we were looking at Aeschylus. And he says, there are no longer protagonists, there is only the chorus. That in life at the time that he was writing, there are no longer these individual heroic characters who are operating within this environment, pursuing their aims. There is only this big group, this mass, that is speaking. And here's a passage where he defines pretty clearly that he's not talking about rich and poor when he talks about the select man and the mass man. He says, quote, "The select man is not the petulant person who thinks himself superior to the rest, but the man who demands more of himself than the rest, even though he may not fulfill in his person those higher exigencies. For there is no doubt that the most radical division that it is possible to make of humanity is that which splits it into two classes of creatures, those who make great demands on themselves, piling up difficulties and duties, and those who demand nothing special of themselves, but for whom to live is to be every moment what they already are, without imposing on themselves any effort towards perfection, mere buoys that float on the waves." Skipping ahead, and here he talks about two types of Buddhism, one being more disciplined and the other one being lesser disciplined. Back to the text. The division of society into masses and select minorities is then not a division into social classes, but into classes of men, and cannot coincide with the hierarchic separation of upper and lower classes. It is, of course, plain that in these upper classes, when and as long as they really are so, there is much more likelihood of finding men who adopt the great vehicle, whereas the lower classes normally comprise individuals of minus quality. But strictly speaking, within both these social classes, there are to be found mass and genuine minority." End quote. So first he's defining the select man as being the one who puts more demands on himself, and the mass man as the one who puts no demands on himself. And while he does acknowledge that both types can be found both in the upper and in the lower class, he says that you're more likely to find the select man in the upper class. And we might agree with that or not, but he is leaning a little bit in that direction. So his definition aligns in some sense with social class, but not perfectly, and that's not the defining criterion. And talking about the effect of this mass coming to social power, he says that this ordinary mind knows that it's ordinary or commonplace, and is so self-assured that it proclaims the rights of the ordinary and imposes them in every context that it can, that it crushes what's different and forces everything to conform to its will. And he makes the distinction that this everybody is not, as it used to be, a diverse group of lots of people doing lots of different jobs, but it's only this mass. It's the group of people that do not ask anything of themselves or do not make any demands on themselves. That because there are so many of them, they form a very powerful block and are able to influence or crush everything. He says, quote, "The characteristic of the hour is that the commonplace mind, knowing itself to be commonplace, has the assurance to proclaim the rights of the commonplace and to oppose them wherever it will. As they say in the United States, to be different is to be indecent. The mass crushes beneath it everything that is different, everything that is excellent, individual, qualified, and select. Anybody who is not like everybody, who does not think like everybody, runs the risk of being eliminated." And it is clear, of course, that this everybody is not everybody. Everybody was normally the complex unity of the mass and the divergent specialized minorities. Nowadays, everybody is the mass alone. Here we have the formidable fact of our times described without any concealment of the brutality of its features. End quote. And he says that this has never happened before in modern history, that to find another example of it, you have to go to the Roman Empire. And he notices an aesthetic similarity that's relevant as well. He writes, quote, "If we wish to find its like, we shall have to take a leap outside our modern history and immerse ourselves in a world, a vital element, entirely different from our own. We shall have to penetrate the ancient world till we reach the hour of its decline. The history of the Roman Empire is also the history of the uprising of the empire of the masses, who absorb and annul the directing minorities and put themselves in their place. Then also is produced the phenomenon of agglomeration, of the full. For that reason, as Spengler has very well observed, it was necessary, just as in our day, to construct enormous buildings. The epoch of the masses is the epoch of the colossal." End quote. So he summarizes the history of the Roman Empire, or at least of its decline, as being that of the directed masses absorbing and annulling and overthrowing the directing minorities. And he notices also that in order to accommodate those masses that it governed, Roman architecture had to be colossal. And we notice in the 20th century the emergence of truly colossal buildings. The Empire State Building was built in 1932. Certainly American and European cities, and thereafter other cities as well, became defined by skyscrapers. And it's interesting to think of how on the one hand you maybe have the Roman Colosseum, an enormous building whose function was to control the masses through various forms of entertainment. And what skyscrapers do is they're a place of work, which, while that work may be valuable or not, depending on the specifics of what it is, may also be viewed as a means of imperial control of the masses. We think of work usually as the opposite of entertainment, but if we're going to follow Ortega y Gasset's thinking here, we might notice that similarity as well. Later, he anchors all of this to the 18th century, and he points out how certain minorities decided that all humans, needing no other qualification but having been born, had fundamental political rights. They had the rights of man and the citizen, and that these are the only rights that there are. The only rights that truly exist are those rights that apply to everyone, and any other kind of right is a privilege. Then he describes how this idea, coming out of the 18th century, spread over the 19th century until they were no longer just ideas, but they took a harder form in what we call democratic legislation. But even then, the mass had not really felt its own power yet. It still felt that it was imposing on an existing system. And he says that today, in the time that he's writing, which is in or before 1929, this is no longer an ideal, but it is a very concrete political reality. He says, quote, not only in legislation, which is the mere framework of public life, but in the heart of every individual, whatever his ideas may be, and even if he be a reactionary in his ideas, that is to say, even when he attacks and castigates institutions by which those rights are sanctioned, end quote. So he says it took a long time for this to permeate the culture, but now it thoroughly has, even in people who are criticizing the institutions that give them the right. And I think there he misses or sort of avoids a fundamental point of those Enlightenment ideas, which is that the state doesn't give you those rights. Humans have them inherently. In a lot of language, they say that God gives you those rights. But more often, people today will be likely to say that we simply have these rights inherently as humans. It's not that the state gives them to you, but you already have them. And this essay is not really about the morality or origin of rights, but he brushes over that there, and I think it's important. And later he gets into how various times have viewed themselves. And he says that most epochs have viewed their own time as being somehow not full enough. And so they look to classical golden ages for inspiration. But he says there are certain times, and he talks about the decades leading up to when he was writing, when it seems like everything is very plentiful, and the period is better than past periods. It's somehow more full, that the people who are alive during that time are really living, whereas the people who lived before them were somehow unfortunate to have missed out on the good time that came later. But he writes of those times, quote, when a period has satisfied its desires, its ideal, this means that it desires nothing more, that the wells of desire have been dried up. That is to say, our famous plenitude is in reality a coming to an end. There are centuries which die of self-satisfaction through not knowing how to renew their desires, just as the happy drone dies after the nuptial flight. Hence, we have the astonishing fact that these epochs of so-called plenitude have always felt in the depths of their consciousness a special form of sadness. End quote. So he says that those periods of wealth and richness have their own sorrow in not knowing what to aim for. And then he says what he thinks characterizes the time that he's living in, and you can decide if you think that this applies to our time as well. And even though a century has passed since then, we are arguably in a similar block. We're dealing with a lot of the same problems that Ortega y Gasset was writing about. He writes, quote, do we not here touch upon the essential difference between our time and that which has just passed away? Our time, in fact, no longer regards itself as definitive. On the contrary, it discovers, though obscurely, deep within itself, an intuition that there are no such epochs, definitive, assured, crystallized, forever. Quite the reverse. The claim that a certain type of existence, the so-called modern culture, is definitive seems to us an incredible narrowing down and shutting out of the field of vision. And as an effect of this feeling, we enjoy a delightful impression of having escaped from a hermetically sealed enclosure, of having regained freedom, of coming out once again under the stars into the world of reality, the world of the profound, the terrible, the unforeseeable, the inexhaustible, where everything is possible, the best and the worst. That faith in modern culture was a gloomy one. It meant that tomorrow was to be in all essentials similar to today, that progress consisted merely in advancing for all time to be along a road identical to the one already under our feet. Such a road is rather a kind of elastic prison which stretches on without ever setting us free. When in the early stages of the empire, some cultured provincial, Lucan or Seneca, arrived in Rome and saw the 21 magnificent imperial buildings, symbols of an enduring power, he felt his heart contract within him. Nothing new could now happen in the world. Rome was eternal. And if there is a melancholy of ruins which rises above them like exhalations from stagnant waters, this sensitive provincial felt a melancholy no less heavy, though of opposite sign, the melancholy of buildings meant for eternity. End quote. So there he's talking about this perception that an existing order will last forever, which is both incorrect and spiritually depressing. And he says that in his time, they were realizing that the dominant culture of that day, or what had been the dominant culture, was not necessarily as solid as it appeared and as eternal. And as I think about our time, I can see on the one hand how the faith in an established culture has dissolved even further, or it has been dissolved. On the one hand, there's a set of subcultures of all kinds of different ideas, many of them very foolish, many of them harmless, some of them both, that has never existed before. But at the same time, I don't think that most people regularly feel that cognitive liberation that Ortega y Gasset is describing there. This is a very nebulous and subjective thing to try to measure, but I think if the press is any indication, people feel that we are on some kind of large meta-historical path that has been defined for us, and you can't easily get off of it. You can only advance on it, rather than charting or choosing other paths to take. But we should remember we do still have that freedom. In the same way people are very ready to challenge traditions, because doing so is fashionable and easy, we also do not have to let our lives be defined by any modern parameters that somebody has made up in the last few decades, and march onward on some path that they've laid out for us. And see how prescient and relevant do you think these lines are for today? And remember, he's writing 100 years ago. Quote, "We live at a time when man believes himself fabulously capable of creation, but he does not know what to create. Lord of all things, he is not Lord of himself. He feels lost amid his own abundance. With more means at its disposal, more knowledge, more technique than ever, turns out that the world today goes the same way as the worst of worlds that have been. It simply drifts. Hence the strange combination of a sense of power and a sense of insecurity, which has taken up its abode in the soul of modern man. Skipping ahead today, by the very fact that everything seems possible to us, we have a feeling that the worst of all is possible. Retrogression, barbarism, decadence." End quote. When he's talking about alertness, he makes a reference to a Roman gesture that I think is the origin of putting your index finger up to your lips in order to indicate for someone to be quiet. But it seems that in the original context, the purpose was not to tell others to be quiet, but if you were a sentinel on duty at night, the idea was that if you were putting your finger to your lips, the contact between your finger and your lips would keep you awake because your lips are very sensitive, and so you'd be feeling your finger on your lips, and that would keep you awake. I'm not sure if that's the origin of that very ordinary, everyday gesture, but if it is, it's an interesting historical detail, and he also makes a nice point with this. He writes, quote, "Every man who adopts a serious attitude before his own existence and makes himself fully responsible for it will feel a certain kind of insecurity, which urges him to keep ever on the alert. The gesture, which the Roman army orders imposed on the sentinel of the legion, was that he should keep his finger on his lips to avoid drowsiness and to maintain his alertness. The gesture has its value. It seems to ordain an even greater silence during the silence of the night, so as to be able to catch the sound of the secret germination of the future." End quote. And I really like that image because it combines alertness, silence, and the Roman Empire, which are all three nice things by themselves. And later he says that it's wrong to say that you can't forecast history and that this has been done many times. And he says, quote, "It is true that it is only possible to anticipate the general structure of the future, but that is all that we in truth understand of the past or of the present. Accordingly, if you want a good view of your own age, look at it from far off." End quote. And I think that last bit is useful advice for perspective anyway. If you want a good view of your own age, look at it from far off. It's very easy because of technology to get totally out of proportion with your attention, and that you give a huge amount of attention to what has happened in the last 24 hours and very little attention to anything else. And I think that's a very dangerous mental habit in general, and it makes you very easy to control. But it also makes it so you have very little sense of the time that you're in, even in a general and structural way. And on the one hand, he brings up this point that we can only know the future very generally, but that's no different from how we know the past very generally, or even the present. I think it's reasonable to draw attention to those latter two things, but I still don't think that we can even forecast the future hardly at all, even in a general sense. We don't know what the rest of the 21st century is going to look like. And of course, I'm saying this after having read some passages in which Ortega y Gasset was very prophetic about the future, but I'm not sure if you can call those comments even a structure of the future. It was more of a warning. Later, he's talking again about the mass man, and one of the things that he says about him is that he deems whatever he finds in himself, his opinions, his appetites, his preferences, his tastes, to be good. And he also trust the first thoughts that come into his head, whereas the excellent man treats with contempt anything that he finds in his mind without effort. Now, the trouble with that is that effort alone isn't necessarily indication of anything. Your first natural gut reaction to something might be correct, and then you could put a lot of effort into thinking about it, and you might just get tangled up and confuse yourself. But it is probably useful to not trust right away those first thoughts that you have, to reevaluate them when you can, especially on questions of consequence. And I feel like there's a line of Descartes that is saying the same thing, that he says something like, I rarely ever trust those first thoughts that occur to me, or something like that. But Ortega y Gasset also points out that no one forces the mass man to acknowledge that he would be unable to run the civilization that allows him to be so content with himself by himself. And that doesn't even mean as one person, but he says only mass men would not be able to run civilization, and yet they have taken it over. And he says that the mass man appeals to no authority since he is not forced to. And, quote, on the contrary, the select man, the excellent man, is urged by interior necessity to appeal from himself to some standard beyond himself, superior to himself, whose service he freely accepts. Skipping ahead, contrary to what is usually thought, it is the man of excellence, and not the common man, who lives in essential servitude. Life has no savor for him unless he makes it consist in service to something transcendental. Hence he does not look upon the necessity of serving as an oppression. Whence by chance such necessity is lacking, he grows restless and invents some new standard, more difficult, more exigent, with which to coerce himself. This is life lived as a discipline, the noble life. Nobility is defined by the demands it makes on us, by obligations, not by rights. End quote. And later he says, quote, as one advances in life, one realizes more and more that the majority of men and of women are incapable of any other effort than that strictly imposed on them as a reaction to external compulsion. And for that reason, the few individuals we have come across who are capable of a spontaneous and joyous effort stand out isolated, monumentalized, so to speak, in our experience. These are the select men, the nobles, the only ones who are active and not merely reactive, for whom life is a perpetual striving, an incessant course of training. End quote. Later he's talking about how rare and difficult science is in history. He writes, quote, has any thought been given to the number of things that must remain active in men's souls in order that there may still continue to be men of science in real truth? Is it seriously thought that as long as there are dollars, there will be science? This notion, in which so many find rest, is only a further proof of primitivism, as if there were not numberless ingredients of most disparate nature to be brought together and shaken up in order to obtain the cocktail of physico-chemical science. Under even the most perfunctory examination of this subject, the evident fact bursts into view that over the whole extent of space and time, physico-chemistry has succeeded in establishing itself completely, only in the small quadrilateral enclosed by London, Berlin, Vienna, and Paris, and that only in the 19th century. End quote. And here's the last passage I wanted to read you. Quote, this is the question. Europe has been left without a moral code. It is not that the mass man has thrown over an antiquated one in exchange for a new one, but that at the center of his scheme of life, there is precisely the aspiration to live without conforming to any moral code. Do not believe a word you hear from the young when they talk about the new morality. I absolutely deny that there exists today in any corner of the continent a group inspired by a new ethos which shows signs of being a moral code. When people talk of the new morality, they are merely committing a new immorality and looking for a way of introducing contraband goods. Hence, it would be a piece of ingenuousness to accuse the man of today of his lack of moral code. The accusation would leave him cold, or rather, would flatter him. Immoralism has become commonplace, and anybody and everybody boasts of practicing it. Skipping ahead, it will not do then to dignify the actual crisis by presenting it as the conflict between two moralities, two civilizations, one in decay, the other at its dawn. The mass man is simply without morality, which is always, in essence, a sentiment of submission to something, a consciousness of service and obligation. End quote. And I wanted to talk about those passages in a bundle, because taken together they show us a bit more about what Ortega y Gasset means when he uses a phrase like the revolt of the masses. And a book like this is always a little bit difficult to talk about because you inevitably want to put yourself in the position of the select man. And it's a little bit vain to approach a book like this in that way because how do you know you're not one of the mass men? And also, how can we be sure that we can take Ortega y Gasset's standards here as indicative of anything? But two of the things he talks about in those passages are a level of self-doubt and an interest in service to something bigger than yourself. And that desire to serve something greater may in itself be a kind of vanity. You're trying to make yourself more important because you're not just little you, you're connected to some noble cause. But he's not only talking about some kind of political or religious or national affiliation. He's talking about an authority to which you appeal in organizing your life. And that authority might be something like reason, that you only accept the thoughts that you can develop that meet some standard of reason, for example. So it's not necessarily an external social project. If you take the example of religion, you can see this on both levels. A religious person might both be interested in proselytizing, in the worldly spreading and visible success of their religious sect, but they would also use their religion, if they're sincere, as a furnace in which to temper themselves. And there are other similar transcendental systems to which a person can apply themselves. And the other thing that he mentioned in there about how the excellent man doesn't trust the first thoughts that come into his head is really only an extension of that first thing. That if, as part of the structure of your life, you appeal to some abstract external authority for what you're doing, you will also do this with your thoughts and with your ideas. And related to all this, he points out that the mass man is the one who doesn't do any of these things. He is his own authority. And you'll notice this is very different from the Nietzschean view. For Nietzsche, the heroic individual who shapes history is the one who determines his own goods and declares them to the world. Now, it would be going too far to say that Ortega y Gasset's mass man is Nietzsche's hero. There are still other significant differences. But if we're talking about this service and this appeal to an outside authority, Nietzsche is not really interested in that, and Ortega y Gasset takes it as pretty central. And what are some of the effects of the subversion of the excellent man by the mass man, according to Ortega y Gasset? One of the things he seems concerned about is science. He says that science is very fragile. It actually needs a lot of components to make it happen, a lot of spiritual components, not just money and not just what you might call education. But that's sort of a theoretical future concern. The one that's more immediate and in his face for him is the problem of immorality in Europe, as he observes it. The mass man has never had an inner sense of service. Ortega y Gasset talks about how the mass man doesn't do anything except what he's compelled to do. So the only way that he ever served anything in the past is because a system forced him to do it. And now that he has gotten control, he's still not interested in service to anything, and he never was. But the difference is that now there's nothing that can compel him into that service. So he says, don't be fooled. This isn't a competition between an old morality and a new one. It's a competition between morality and the absence of morality. And I think it would be reasonable to assemble one further thought from what he's said here that I don't think he said explicitly. And 100 years later, we can look around and decide whether we think that Ortega y Gasset was correct about that. Now, looking at this book generally, I'm always cautious about framings that put most people in one basket and then there's a few people who are special in some way. Because as humans, as I said, we're inevitably drawn to wanting to put ourselves in that special basket. But there is something to this. And if you think of all the people that you've known in your life, you can certainly think of some people in whom all the lights are on. And this isn't only intelligence, but they're thoughtful, energetic people who are trying to get a grip on life somehow. And that might be a futile project anyway, but they're trying. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And then there are some people, and again, their conversation or level of formal education is not the key indicator here. You could look at their lifestyle and see that they are doing something different. And you can see that they don't do anything unless they are compelled to do it. And that by itself doesn't mean that Ortega y Gasset is correct about everything. But because it goes against a lot of 21st century dogma, we are very cautious to acknowledge directly that there might be categories like mass men and select men. And of course, all of this applies to women as well. And if we grant that these differences exist, even in only the most basic, vague sense, then Ortega y Gasset's interpretation of the past 150, and for us 250 years, may make some sense because there was a significant political change during that period. We usually refer to it as the spread of democracy, and we usually think of it as a good thing. and maybe it was mostly a good thing. But it's possible that it was good in certain ways, and it had some negative side effects. And I'm not a monarchist. I don't necessarily think that monarchy is better than democracy. But to refuse to consider possible shortcomings in democracy, you have only to be so blinded by the contemporary ideology as to be unwilling to scrutinize it. The more objective position here is to consider that it may be, for example, that democracy is in some sense more fair, but it also has these cultural side effects. And even democracy may not be as democratic as we wish it were. And Ortega y Gasset doesn't even go as far as arguing against democracy. But if a modern person reads his book, they might be a little bit squeamish because it goes further than anything that will ever come anywhere near the New York Times bestseller list to pointing in that direction. But we can leave it there for now. If you got anything useful out of this podcast, I hope you will send it to a thoughtful friend who you think will benefit from it as well. Other than that, farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.